The most famous escape in human history lasted one night. 600,000 men, women, children, livestock, everything they owned on their backs, running. Behind them, 600 chariots. Egypt's finest, the most powerful military force on earth, bearing down across open desert. Ahead of them, deep, wide, impassable water. And then something happened that no one who witnessed it ever forgot. But here's what Sunday school never told you. The Egyptians were writing that night too. Their scribes recorded what they saw. Their priests carved it into temple walls. Their military commanders filed reports. And what they wrote, and what they deliberately erased, tells a story more devastating than anything in the book of Exodus. This is the Red Sea crossing. Not the movie version, the real one. Every detail grounded in archaeology, Egyptian records, and the geography of a landscape that still holds its secrets today. Let's go back. The year is approximately 1446 BC. Though some scholars argue for 1250 BC, and we'll get to why that debate changes everything. Egypt is the superpower of the known world. The new kingdom is at its absolute height. Pharaoh commands armies that have never been defeated in open battle. His engineers have built monuments that will outlast every civilization on earth. His people worship him, not as a representative of the gods, but as a living God himself. Divine, untouchable, eternal. And somewhere, in the eastern delta region of Egypt, in a cluster of brick-making settlements the Bible calls Goshen, 2 million Israelites are packing. They have been slaves for 400 years. 4 centuries of mud and straw and quotas and whips. 4 centuries of watching their sons pulled from their mother's arms and thrown into the Nile. 4 centuries of building cities they would never live in. Temples to gods they did not worship. Monuments to a pharaoh who did not know their names. And now, after 10 plagues have dismantled the most powerful civilization on earth, one catastrophe at a time, Pharaoh has finally said the word they thought they would never hear in their lifetimes. Go. But he would change his mind. He always changed his mind. Before we follow them into the desert, we need to talk about what Egypt was recording while all of this was happening. Because the silence in the Egyptian record is as loud as anything ever written. Egyptian scribes documented everything. Every military campaign was carved into temple walls in exhausting detail. Every Nile flood level was recorded. Cattle counts, labor reports, tax collections, trade negotiations. The Egyptians maintained administrative records with a precision that would impress modern bureaucracies. They were compulsive, obsessive, meticulous, record keepers. And yet, for the reign of the pharaoh most scholars associate with the Exodus, there is a strange, deliberate, unmistakable gap. The Ipuwer Papyrus, currently housed in the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, Netherlands. This is one of the most contested documents in all of Egyptology. It's an ancient Egyptian lament written by a man named Ipuwer, describing a series of national catastrophes that overturned the natural order of Egyptian society. Read the language carefully. The river is blood. Men shrink from tasting it. Grain has perished everywhere. The land is in darkness. Fire runs along the ground. The children of princes are dashed against walls. Egyptologists have argued for decades about whether this document describes the biblical plagues or an earlier period of political collapse. The dating is disputed, the interpretation is disputed, but the language, the raw, devastating language of a civilization that has been struck by something it cannot explain or survive, is undeniable. Something catastrophic happened to Egypt. An Egyptian wrote it down. And here is what is equally, and perhaps more, remarkable. In the reign of Ramesses II, one of the two strongest candidates for the Exodus pharaoh, Egyptian administrative records suddenly go entirely silent about a massive Semitic slave population in the Eastern Delta that had been meticulously documented for generations. They were there, systematically cataloged, counted, assigned, taxed in labor, and then they were not. Not displaced, not relocated, not mentioned again. The records that might explain their sudden disappearance are gone. And not just gone, erased. In ancient Egypt, to erase a name from stone was the ultimate act of condemnation. They called it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, to be unmade from history itself. Someone decided that whatever happened with the Israelites, whatever those final days looked like, whatever the plagues cost, whatever happened at that body of water in the desert, was not to be remembered. The erasure itself is a form of testimony. You do not erase what did not happen.
Now we follow them into the desert. And immediately, geography becomes the most critical tool we have. The Hebrew text of Exodus uses the term Yam Suf. For centuries, translators rendered this as Red Sea, and that translation has shaped every painting, every film, every children's Bible ever produced. But Yam Suf in Hebrew does not mean Red Sea. It means Sea of Reeds. And the location of the crossing is one of the most fiercely and fascinatingly contested questions in all of biblical archaeology. Three main routes have been proposed by scholars. The northern route, Lake Serbonus along the Mediterranean coast, a shallow, brackish lake separated from the sea by a long, narrow sandbar. Ancient armies have crossed this sandbar. Ancient armies have also been swallowed by it when the sand shifted without warning. It's geographically plausible, but Exodus 13:17 explicitly rules it out. God led them away from the road through Philistine country, even though that road was shorter. The central route runs through the Bitter Lakes region, a chain of shallow lakes that once formed a natural connection to the northern tip of the Gulf of Suez, before the construction of the Suez Canal permanently altered the hydrology of the entire region. This is the most widely supported candidate among mainstream scholars today. In 1882, British General Alexander Tulloch personally observed a strong east wind pushing the shallow waters of Lake Timsah back far enough to expose the lakebed. He measured it. He published his findings. He noted that the effect was temporary. When the wind stopped, the water rushed back quickly and violently. His first-hand observation became one of the most cited pieces of evidence in modern Exodus scholarship. The southern route follows the traditional site at the northern tip of the Gulf of Suez, the deep, dramatic, cinematic crossing of Hollywood imagination. The problem here is mathematical. The Gulf of Suez at its northern end is deep. Moving 2 million people and their livestock across a deep sea arm in a single night requires either a much larger miracle than the text describes, or a fundamentally different understanding of the population numbers. But here is what the text itself is clear about. Exodus 14:21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. All that night, a strong east wind. This is not instantaneous Hollywood spectacle. This is a sustained meteorological event working through an entire night of darkness and fear and waiting.
Now picture the camp. 2 million people pressed against the water's edge. The night sky above them is clear. The desert is cold. Behind them, the sound they can feel through the ground before they can hear it with their ears. The vibration of 600 chariot wheels on packed sand. 600 chosen officers. Exodus 14:7. Pharaoh had brought his elite force. Not a border patrol, not a standard pursuit unit. His best, his fastest, his most decorated commanders. He came personally. He intended to end this. The people turn on Moses. Of course they do. Don't judge them, they do. Human beings under extreme stress reach for the familiar, even when the familiar was a prison. Exodus 14:11. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? 4 centuries of slavery and 3 months of freedom, and now water in front of them, and the most powerful army on earth behind them, and the desert flanking them on both sides. The logic of despair is perfectly understandable. Moses answers with words that should not have been humanly possible for a man standing in that position. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Then he raises his staff, and the wind comes. A study published in 2010 by researchers at the National Center for Atmospheric Research modeled the Exodus crossing using modern fluid dynamics. They found that a consistent east wind of approximately 63 miles per hour, sustained over 12 hours, could push back a body of water 6 feet deep across a width of 2.5 miles, exposing a dry land bridge roughly 2.5 miles long and 3 miles wide. Their models showed the exposed crossing would remain stable as long as the wind held. When the wind stopped, the water would return, and rapidly and completely in a matter of minutes. The mathematics of the miracle. Wind speed, water depth, duration, crossing time. All of it physically coherent. All of it consistent with the text. They walk across on dry ground, not muddy, not waterlogged. The text specifically uses the word dry. The same God who commanded the wind to open the water also prepared the surface beneath their feet. Children walked across. Old men walked across. Livestock walked across. Women carrying everything they owned walked across ground that had been underwater for centuries. And then the Egyptians follow. This decision reveals everything about the psychology of power in the ancient world. Pharaoh was a god. His chariots had conquered nations. His soldiers had never retreated from an enemy. When they see the water pulled back, when they see this impossible corridor of dry land cutting through the sea, they do not stop. They do not question it.
They do not ask what force opened it, or what that force might do when they are in the middle of it. They ride in. Exodus 14:23. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. What happens next in Exodus 14:24 is one of the most militarily precise details in the entire narrative. During the last watch of the night, the period from approximately 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed their chariot wheels so that they had difficulty driving. Jammed chariot wheels in wet, muddy ground at the edges of the corridor where the wind effect was weakest and the ground was softest. A chariot with locked or mired wheels in waterlogged sand is not a weapon. It is a cage. The horses panic. The drivers cannot control them. The formation breaks apart. Soldiers collide with each other. Command structure dissolves into chaos. And in that chaos, the Egyptians feel something shift. Exodus 14:25. The Egyptians said, "Let us get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them, against Egypt." They tried to turn around. The text tells us they tried to flee, but the last watch of the night is ending. The Israelites are through. Moses stands on the far bank. God tells him to stretch out his hand again over the water. The wind stops, and the sea returns. Exodus 14:28. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Investigative shift. Now, what did Pharaoh do? This is where the Egyptian record becomes extraordinary, in what it refuses to say. In the Egyptian New Kingdom, military campaigns were the highest form of national glory. Every victory was carved into temple walls in massive, detailed, triumphant relief. Enemies trampled underfoot beneath the giant feet of Pharaoh. Captives in chains stretching to the horizon. The Pharaoh standing in his chariot, bow drawn, enemies falling before him like wheat. It was relentless, exhausting, unapologetic propaganda carved into stone to last for eternity. The Battle of Kadesh, where Ramesses II was fought to a complete stalemate by the Hittite army, where his own forces were surrounded and nearly destroyed, where the battle ended in a treaty rather than a victory, was carved into the walls of Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, Karnak, Luxor, and Abydos as a magnificent personal triumph. The Egyptians had absolutely no cultural framework for recording military failure. Failure did not exist in the official record. It was theologically impossible. Pharaoh was divine. Divine beings do not lose. And yet, for the pursuit into the sea, for the 600 elite chariots, for the army that followed escaped slaves into a corridor of parted water, nothing. No temple wall records the campaign. No victory stele commemorates the pursuit. No inscription lists the soldiers who participated. No document accounts for the horses. No record explains where the chariots went. An entire elite military force rode into the desert pursuing escaped slaves and simply does not appear again in the historical record. They went out. They did not come back. And the most documentation-obsessed civilization in human history carved nothing about it. The silence is the testimony. But there is one more Egyptian record worth examining, and it is the most haunting of all. The Merneptah stele, discovered in 1896 by the archaeologist Flinders Petrie in the ruins of Merneptah's mortuary temple at Thebes, currently on display at the Cairo Museum. Carved in approximately 1208 BC, it is the earliest known reference to Israel by name anywhere in the archaeological record outside the Bible. Pharaoh Merneptah lists his military campaigns. Libyan invasions repelled, Canaanite cities captured, peoples subdued. And then, near the end of the inscription, one entry that stopped Egyptologists cold when they first translated it. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more. Egyptologists classify this as a standard victory inscription. But examine it carefully. Every city and territory listed on the stele carries a specific hieroglyphic determinative, a symbol that categorizes what kind of entity is being described. Canaan, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, all carry the determinative symbol for a settled land, a place with fixed borders and cities. Israel alone carries the determinative for a people.
God of Abraham, hear
not
my
a
plea.
place,
Guide us through this
a
night.
people.
Protect us from harm.
A mobile,
Grant us strength.
unsettled,
Amen.
landless people moving through the region. In 1208 BC, 40 years after the Exodus, if we use the early date, the Egyptian Empire knew Israel existed. Knew Israel was a people without a fixed homeland, was trying, once again, to eliminate them from history by declaring them destroyed. And once again, the attempt at erasure became its own form of evidence. The stele, meant to announce Israel's end, became the oldest surviving proof that Israel existed. Now step back from the scholarship and stand at the water's edge. Not as a historian, not as a theologian, as a person. You have been in slavery your entire life. Every person you have ever loved has been in slavery. Your parents were slaves. Their parents were slaves, going back 10 generations. You have never made a single choice about where you sleep, or what you eat, or what you build with your hands. Your labor has belonged to someone else since the day you were born. And 3 months ago, everything changed. Plagues came, the Nile turned, the sky went dark in the middle of the day. The firstborn died. And the man who owned your life looked at you in the middle of the night and said, "Go." And now you are standing at the edge of impassable water, with an army behind you and a man in front of you holding a wooden staff over the waves. You cannot swim. You cannot fight 600 chariots. You cannot go back to Egypt, not after Passover night. You can only stand still and watch and see whether the God who cracked the sky open over Egypt can do anything about the water directly in front of you. And the wind comes. What does faith look like in that moment? It does not look like certainty. It does not look like confidence.
It looks like standing at the edge of a sea that has not moved yet, and choosing not to run. It looks like watching the water begin to pull back, slowly, then faster, then dramatically, and deciding to put one foot on ground that was underwater an hour ago. It looks like walking through while the walls of water catch the first light of dawn on both sides of you, and you cannot stop looking at them because you have never seen anything like this in your life. And you are not entirely sure you are still alive. And then you reach the other side, and you turn around, and you watch the water return.
The Egyptians had a word for what happened that night. We do not know exactly what it was, because they did not write it down. They couldn't. To write it down would be to admit that their god-king rode his divine chariot into a sea corridor opened by a foreign god, and drowned, pursuing escaped slaves. That the most powerful military force on earth was destroyed by wind and water at the command of a shepherd with a staff. That 2 million people who had built Egypt's greatest monuments walked away, and the mightiest empire in human history stood on the shore with nothing left to send after them. So they said nothing. They carved other victories on other walls. They listed other campaigns against other enemies. They buried the administrative records of the slaves who had built Pithom and Ramses. They erased names from monuments. They filled 400 years of shared history with deliberate, calculated silence. But the silence speaks. It always speaks, and it has been speaking for 3,400 years. The parting of the Red Sea is not a children's story to be illustrated with construction paper and blue streamers. It is a historical event so catastrophic to the Egyptian national identity that the most meticulous record keepers in the ancient world chose total silence over any acknowledgement of what happened. It shook the entire ancient Near East. 40 years later, when Israelite spies entered the city of Jericho, a woman named Rahab told them, quote, "We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you." The nations heard. The nations remembered. The story traveled faster than any Egyptian army. Because some things cannot be erased. Not by silence. Not by chisels. Not by the most powerful propaganda machine the ancient world ever produced. The water opened. The people walked through on dry ground. The army drowned. And the God who made the sea demonstrated once and permanently that he could unmake it whenever he chose. When you feel cornered, when the obstacle in front of you is too wide to cross and too deep to survive, and the pressure behind you is real and closing fast, remember what he did with a strong east wind and one man willing to raise his staff and wait. He did not calm the water. He moved it. He turned the obstacle into the road. He has done it before. He will do it again.
If this changed how you see the Exodus, if you feel the weight of what actually happened that night, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who thinks the Bible is mythology, because the archaeology and the silence of Egypt tell a very different story. And drop your answer in the comments. What hit you hardest? The Ipuwer Papyrus? The Egyptian silence after the crossing? The fluid dynamics study? The Merneptah Stele? Tell me. I read every one.